The desert night was quiet, save for the hiss of the wind brushing through mesquite trees. A single fire burned low on the edge of the San Pedro River, its light flickering across the face of a young woman. Her name was Naline, an Apache bride barely 17. Tonight was supposed to have been her wedding night, a celebration of love, family, and tradition. Instead, it was a night of tears. Hours earlier, soldiers had ridden into her people's camp. They came not with respect, but with arrogance, armed with whiskey, rifles, and orders to crush anything that seemed uncivilized. In their eyes, Apache traditions were nothing but rebellion. They stormed the gathering, scattering families, overturning clay pots, and spitting on sacred songs. And when they saw Naline, dressed in her white deerskin dress, her hair braided with eagle feathers, they laughed. One of them grabbed her, another sneered. They spoke words she didn't fully understand, but the meaning was clear. Her beauty, her pride, her hair long and black as midnight, was a mark of everything they despised. With a hunting knife, they cut it away. The braids fell like dark rivers in the dust. Her people cried out, but they were held back by bayonets and rifles. For an Apache bride, her hair was not vanity. It was memory, honor, a tie to her ancestors. To cut it was to shame her spirit. Now, seated by the fire, Naline rocked back and forth, clutching the broken braids in trembling hands. Tears streaked her cheeks. She whispered prayers, old words taught by her grandmother. But the shame felt heavier than the sky itself. On the ridge above, someone watched. A cowboy, tall in the saddle, his hat pulled low. He had seen what happened. He had no stake in the quarrel between soldiers and Apaches, so he told himself. But the sight of the soldiers laughing, the girl humiliated, burned something deep in his chest. He was no saint, but he knew cruelty when he saw it. The cowboy's name was Jonas Hale, a drifter, once a ranch hand, once a soldier himself, before he walked away from the army's orders. He had seen too much blood, too much injustice painted in the name of civilization. Watching Naline's tears by the fire, he felt the old weight return. Choices he thought he left behind, now knocking at his conscience. Below, the Apache elders spoke in hushed tones. Revenge was whispered. Rage burned like dry grass, waiting for a spark. But Naline only wept. Her words cracked the silence. They cut my hair to shame me. Cowboy, she whispered to no one, her voice barely carried by the fire's glow. They took my honor. They laughed while I cried. Jonas, from the ridge, heard those words, carried on the desert wind. He closed his eyes. He could ride on, keep to his own trail, let the world destroy itself. But he knew he wouldn't, not this time, because, tonight, under the desert stars, the story of the shamed Apache bride had just become his story too. Jonas Hale rode down from the ridge slowly, his horse's hooves muffled in the sand. He knew that if the Apache scouts saw him too close, they might put an arrow through his chest before he could even explain why he came. But something in the girl's broken voice haunted him. He couldn't turn away, not this time. The Apaches noticed him, of course. They always did. A young warrior stepped out from the shadows, bow taut, arrow aimed at Jonas's heart. The cowboy raised his hand, his rifle still holstered, his voice steady. "I mean no harm," Jonas said. "I saw what they did, and I ain't here to fight you." The warrior's eyes narrowed. The elders whispered among themselves. Naline looked up, her tear-streaked face catching the firelight. She had seen his silhouette on the ridge, heard his horse before the others. Something in her heart stirred not trust, but curiosity. An older man, his hair streaked with gray, finally spoke. He was Chief Dason Naline, as uncle. Why does a white man come down the ridge in the night? We have nothing to give you. Your people have already taken enough. Jonas dismounted, hands still away from his gun. His boots sank into the sand. I'm no soldier, he said. Not anymore. I left that life, but I saw what they did to her. To you. It ain't right, the Apache warriors murmured, half in disbelief, half in suspicion. To them, the words of a white man were a snake's, hiss-soft and dangerous. But Naline's voice cut through the doubt. He speaks true, she whispered, her fingers clutching the severed braids in her lap. He watched, he heard. Jonas looked at her, and for a moment their eyes locked. He saw not just sorrow, but fire spirit, humiliated, yet unbroken. He remembered women back east, scarred and beaten by men in uniforms, their dignity stripped by cruelty. He remembered turning away then. He wouldn't again. Chief Dason studied Jonas with the sharp patience of a hawk. Finally, he said, if you are not soldier, then you are drifter. And drifters bring only trouble. But tonight, trouble already sits at our fire. His voice lowered, heavy with rage. They cut my niece's hair. They spit on our blood. The soldiers think we will bow. They are wrong. The warriors growled their agreement, hands gripping knives and bows tighter. Revenge was close, a storm ready to break. Jonas felt it too, but he also knew soldiers. He knew how they fought truthless, with cannons, rifles, and orders that cared nothing for justice. If the Apache struck now, it would be slaughter. You can't meet Hedden, Jonas said quietly. Not if you aim to survive. Chief Dason's eyes narrowed. Then you tell us, cowboy, what do you know of survival? You walk into fire that is not yours. Why? Jonas hesitated. The fire popped, sparks climbing into the night sky. His voice was low when he answered. Because I seen too much taken, and I can't watch it happen again. The silence that followed was long, broken only by the crackle of the flames and Naline's uneven breathing. The Apache were not a people who trusted easterly, especially not men who wore boots and hats like Jonas. But something in his tone, in the shadow of guilt that hung on him, made them pause. Naline finally spoke, her voice steadier than before. Then ride with us, cowboy. If your heart is true, prove it. Help us take back our honor. Jonas looked into her eyes, and he knew he was already bound. The shame that cut her was now his burden too. The fire burned lower as the night stretched on. Coyotes howled from the mesas, and the desert seemed to listen to the whispers of grief around the circle. Naline sat silently now, her hands no longer trembling, but her eyes still heavy with sorrow. Her braids lay in her lap like black snakes. Jonas Hale sat on a rock apart from the Apache, his hat tipped forward, staring into the embers. He felt like an intruder in this sacred space, a stranger among people who had every reason to hate him. But Naline's words from earlier lingered. Help us take back our honor. He wasn't sure if he was capable of giving anyone honor, not when his own past felt so stained. Chief Dason finally broke the silence. The soldiers came because they believe we are weak. They shame our daughters. They think we will crawl. His voice was low, steady, but filled with rage. But in the morning we ride. We strike their patrol before they strike again. The warriors nodded, some pounding their fists against their chests. Naline raised her head. I will ride too, she said, her voice firm, though her face was streaked with tears. Gasps went around the circle. Young women did not ride into battle. Brides were meant to weave, to sing, to keep the fire of family alive. But her voice carried the weight of a wound no elder could silence. Dazen turned to her sharply. You are bride. You carry the spirit of our mothers. You do not fight. But Naline shook her head. They cut my hair. They mocked my spirit. If I do not stand, I will live in shame. I will not live in shame. Her words struck like arrows. Even the warriors fell silent. Finally, one of the older women, wrinkled as dried cedar bark, nodded slowly. Let her ride. Shame can kill faster than any bullet. Let her fight. Jonas watched the scene unfold, torn between admiration and fear. He admired her courage, but he also knew how ruthless the soldiers could be. He couldn't let her charge blindly into death. He spoke, his voice calm but edged with steel. If you're going to fight, you need more than courage. You need a plan. Soldiers don't scare easy, and they sure as hell don't forgive. The warriors glared at him, suspicious of a white man daring to speak at their fire. But Dazen raised his hand. And what does the cowboy suggest? Jonas shifted, remembering the countless raids he had seen as a soldier. You don't fight where they're strong. You fight where they're weak. They ride heavy with rifles and wagons. That makes them slow. You strike when they ain't ready, when their guard's down. At night, in the canyons where their horses can't run. Murmurs rippled through the warriors. Some nodded, some spat. But Dasen's eyes lingered on Jonas, measuring him. You talk like a man who knows the ways of the enemy. Jonas's jaw tightened. I was one of them once. That's how I know. Naline's gaze lifted to him. There was no pity in her eyes, only a quiet recognition. She understood what it meant to carry a wound no one could see. Dasan finally stood, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the fire. So be it. At dawn we ride, with bow, with knife, with fire, and this cowboy he rides with us. Jonas exhaled slowly. He hadn't truly chosen this path. He looked at Naline, and in that moment he swore a vow in silence. If blood was to be spilled, he would see that she lived through it. Even if he did not, the fire popped, sparks flying into the desert night like scattered stars. The first pale streaks of dawn stretched over the desert horizon, painting the mesas in gold and blood-red hues. The Apache camp stirred with quiet urgency. Warriors tied bows to their saddles, sharpened knives, and smeared ash across their faces in silent ritual. Horses snorted and stamped, their eyes flashing in the dim light. Naline stood apart, her deerskin dress now bound at the waist with a warrior's sash. Her shorn hair, once her pride, now framed her face in uneven strands. To others it was shame, but this morning she wore it like armor. Her eyes were no longer filled with tears. They were sharpened with purpose. Jonas Hale tightened the cinch on his horse, his movements steady and practiced. He remembered mornings like this, soldiers readying for raids, the smell of sweat and gun oil in the air. But this was different. The Apache prepared not with drunken laughter or shouted orders, but with silence. A silence so heavy it felt like prayer. Chief Dazen approached Jonas, his hawk-like gaze sharp. "You ride with us, cowboy. But know this: if your tongue lies, if your heart falters, your blood will be the first spilled." Jonas nodded, his voice calm. "Fair enough. I reckon I wouldn't trust me either." Dyson studied him for a long moment, then turned away, barking orders in Apache. The warriors mounted their horses, the air tense with anticipation. Naline swung herself onto a painted mare, her small frame steady in the saddle. A murmur rippled among the warriors at the sight, but no one dared challenge her. Now Jonas rode up beside her. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. Her eyes stayed forward. "They tried to break me, cowboy. Instead, they gave me reason to fight." Jonas couldn't help but feel a rough edge of respect. She wasn't just riding for herself, she was riding for every woman, every child who had been spat on, mocked, and silenced. The war party set off, hooves thundering softly across the hard desert earth. Dust rose behind them in golden clouds, caught by the newborn sun. Jonas kept close to Naline, his rifle strapped across his back, his revolver heavy at his hip. As they rode, he spoke in a low voice, giving what advice he could. "They'll have scouts posted. Best ways to draw 'em out, make 'em think they're safe. Then strike quick and vanish. Don't give 'em a chance to regroup." The warriors listened, some grudgingly. They didn't like taking counsel from a white man, but his words carried the weight of truth. Chief Dason gave a curt nod. By mid-morning, they reached a narrow canyon. Jonas reined in his horse eyes, scanning the ridges. The canyon walls were steep, jagged, perfect for an ambush. He dismounted, crouching low, running his hand across the dirt. "Tracks," he muttered. "Fresh cavalry wagons. They came through here at dawn." He looked up, his jaw tightening. "They ain't far ahead." Naline's grip tightened on her reins. The warriors bristled, bows strung, knives ready. Chief Dazen raised his hand. Silence fell. "We strike here," Dazen said. Jonas frowned. "Here. They'll have the high ground if they spot us." Dyson's eyes burned. "Then we will take the high ground first." Before Jonas could argue, the warriors began to spread out along the canyon walls, moving like shadows against stone. Naline dismounted, following silently, her knife at her side. Jonas hesitated, his gut twisting. He knew this ground, knew how quickly it could turn into slaughter if a single mistake was made. And yet, as he looked at Naline, climbing the canyon wall, her fire unshaken, he felt his resolve harden. If this was the path she chose, he would ride it beside her, no matter where it led. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of dust and iron somewhere ahead. Soldiers marched, laughing, unaware that vengeance rode on their heels. The canyon was silent, but not with peace. It was the kind of silence that came before thunder. The Apache warriors spread along the ridges like spirits of stone, their dark eyes glinting with resolve. Naline crouched low, her knife clutched tight, her breathing steady despite the storm inside her. Jonas Hale lay on his belly near the canyon floor, his rifle steady across a rock. He had chosen his place carefully. He had fought in enough ambushes to know the first shot mattered most. The air smelled of dust and horses, and each second felt like it stretched into eternity. Then they heard it, the faint jangle of bridles, the grinding of wagon wheels. Soldiers appeared at the canyon's mouth, sun flashing off their brass buttons and rifles. They rode in careless formation, their laughter echoing off the stone walls. To them, the desert was empty, the Apaches already cowed by fear. Jonas's jaw clenched. He could pick out the lieutenant by his stiff posture, his hand resting lazily on his saber. Behind the wagons, mules dragged supplies, whiskey, ammunition, maybe even the spoils of stolen camps. Rage burned hotter in Jonas's chest. He remembered faces, other girls, other camps, broken beneath the boots of men just like these. Chief Dazen raised his hand from his perch high above. The warriors held their breath. Every bowstring was taut, every rifle ready. The world seemed to stop. Then Dazen's hand dropped. The canyon exploded with sound. Arrows whistled, rifles cracked, and the echoes bounced from wall to wall like rolling thunder. Horses reared, screaming. Soldiers shouted in panic, scrambling to form ranks. But chaos already had them by the throat. Naline's arrow flew true, striking a soldier's hat clean off his head. She didn't pause, she fired again, and this time the man toppled backward off his horse. Her chest heaved, but her eyes burned with fierce resolve. Jonas fired once, twice, each shot, deliberate, not wasted. He hit a wagon wheel, splintering it, sending crates of supplies tumbling into the dust. Soldiers cursed, tripping over the wreckage. "Hold the line," the lieutenant roared, his saber flashing as he tried to rally his men. But his voice was swallowed by the canyon's fury. The Apache warriors rained fire from above, vanishing and reappearing like ghosts. Knives flashed, rifles barked, and the canyon became a storm of dust, smoke, and blood. Jonas leaped from cover, pulling his revolver as a soldier charged him. The man swung his bayonet, but Jonas sidestepped, slamming the butt of his revolver into his jaw. The soldier dropped, groaning. Jonas didn't hesitate. He kicked the rifle away and turned back to the fight. Naline, from the ridge, spotted the lieutenant barking orders. Her breath caught. She remembered his face. He was one of those who had laughed when her braids fell into the dust. Her hands trembled, but she forced the bow steady. Her arrow loosed, flying straight until a soldier shoved the lieutenant aside at the last second. The arrow struck the man's chest, and he fell, gasping. The lieutenant sneered, his saber pointing upward. "The girl," he shouted. Bullets ripped toward her perch, stone splintering. Naline ducked, her heart pounding. Jonas saw it from below. Rage boiled in him, hot and sharp. He fired back, forcing the soldiers to cover, buying her a moment to crawl behind the ridge. The battle raged for what felt like hours, though it was only minutes. Dust turned the sun red, smoke stung the eyes, and the screams of men and horses filled the canyon. And then suddenly it was over. The soldiers broke, fleeing the canyon in shambles, leaving wagons burning and bodies behind. A few escaped, spurring their horses hard, dust trails vanishing into the horizon. The Apaches raised their cries of victory, voices echoing against the cliffs. But Naline did not cheer. She stared at the lieutenant's retreating figure, her chest heaving. He had escaped. The man who had shamed her still lived, and deep inside her she knew this fight was not finished. The canyon still reeked of smoke and blood long after the last shot. Vultures circled above, black wings casting fleeting shadows over the broken wagons and fallen men. The Apache warriors moved like ghosts among the wreckage, stripping rifles, cartridges, and anything useful. For them, survival was always the true prize. Nalene stood on the ridge where she had fought, her bow hanging limp at her side. Her hands were steady, but her heart hammered with the memory of the lieutenant's sneer. He had seen her. He had called her out. And though she had fought bravely, he had slipped away. The shame cut deeper than before, because now it was tied to unfinished vengeance. Jonas climbed the ridge toward her, wiping dust and blood from his face. His revolver smoked faintly, and a fresh graze cut across his forearm. He moved with the weariness of a man who had seen too many battlefields. When he reached her, he didn't speak right away. He just stood beside her, watching the horizon where the survivors had fled. "You fought hard," he finally said, his voice low. "Harder than most men I've known." Nalene's jaw tightened. "But he still lives. The one who mocked me. The one who cut my hair." Jonas's eyes darkened. And that means he'll be back. Men like him don't take shame easy. He'll bring more soldiers next time. Maybe twice as many." Her breath hitched, though she tried to hide it. "Then we will fight again." Down below, the warriors raised their victory cries, but Chief Dason's face was carved from stone. He walked among the dead without joy. His people had won, yes, but he knew the price that would follow. For every soldier that bled in this canyon, the army would demand payment in Apache lives. He turned to Jonas as the cowboy descended with Nalene. "This was only a battle. The war will come now. Do you understand what you have brought upon yourself?" Jonas met his gaze steadily. "I understand. But war was coming whether I rode with you or not. Better to face it standing than waiting for the blade." Dason studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "You have fought with honor, but honor does not feed us, and it does not keep our children safe. We must move the camp before the soldiers return." The warriors began gathering their families, loading what little they had onto ponies. Women pulled children close, their eyes haunted by both fear and pride. Nellie knelt by the fire where she had cried the night before. She laid her cut braids in the flames, watching them curl into smoke and ash. For the first time, her tears did not fall. She whispered in her tongue, a prayer not for shame, but for strength. Jonas watched her quietly. There was something in her resilience that stirred an ache in him. She was young, yet the fire in her spirit was older than the desert itself. He found himself thinking of his own past battles, fought for causes that meant nothing, of lives lost in the name of a flag that never cared for them. As the last of her braids turned to ash, Nalene rose and turned to him. "Cowboy," she said softly, "I do not thank you for pity. I thank you for fighting beside me." Jonas tipped his hat. Wasn't pity, just seemed the right thing to do. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned to join her people as they prepared to move. Jonas mounted his horse, scanning the horizon. Somewhere out there, the lieutenant rode with vengeance burning in his veins. Jonas knew it wasn't over, not for him, not for Nalene, not for the Apache. The canyon was theirs today, but the desert had a way of keeping score, and debts were never forgotten. By the second night, the Apache camp had moved deep into the shadow of the Dragoon Mountains. Fires were kept small, voices hushed. The people carried victory in their hearts, but fear lingered like smoke. They knew the soldiers would not forget the canyon Nayland sat near the edge of camp, sharpening a knife by moonlight. Her face had hardened since the night of her shaming. She was no longer the bride who wept by the fire. She was a warrior in spirit, if not in name. Still, each scrape of stone against steel carried the memory of the lieutenant's laughter. His shadow lived in her thoughts. Jonas Hale kept watch on the ridge above the camp, his rifle across his knees. The desert stretched wide and pale under the moon, every rock and cactus sharp in silver light. He had not slept since the ambush. He knew soldiers. He knew they would return sooner than anyone wanted to believe, and he was right, just before dawn. A faint glimmer caught his eyelight reflecting off metal. Far out on the horizon, dark shapes moved in steady lines. Horses, wagons, more men than before. Jonas's stomach sank. This wasn't a patrol. It was a column. The army had returned. He slid down the ridge fast, boots sliding on loose rock. Dazed, he barked as he hit the camp. They're coming. Dozens of them, maybe more. Your canyon victory stirred a hornet's nest. Chief Dazen rose, his eyes hard but unsurprised. I knew the white man's pride would not suffer defeat. He turned, shouting orders in Apache. Warriors rushed to ready their weapons, women to pack what little food and water they had. Children were ushered into hiding. Nalene stood, knife still in hand. Her voice was steady. Then we fight again. Jonas grabbed her arm, pulling her aside. Listen to me. This ain't like before. They ain't coming to skirmish. They're coming to wipe you out. Men, women, children, don't matter. They'll burn everything. You stay, you die. Her dark eyes locked on his. And if we run, where do we go? The desert holds no mercy. Better to die fighting than starving in the sands. Jonas cursed under his breath. She was right, but so was he. The sound of distant drums carried on the wind, the rhythmic beat of hooves and wagon wheels. The soldiers were closing in. Dazen approached, his face grim. You rode with us once, cowboy. What do you see now? Jonas hesitated, then spoke with iron in his voice. I see you can't fight straight on. Not with your people here. You need to move the families into the mountains. Use the land split, their forces, bleed dry. Make the desert your ally. Dazen's gaze was sharp, calculating. Then he nodded once. And you? Will you ride with us again? Jonas looked toward the horizon, where dust rose like a storm cloud. His jaw tightened. I reckon I've been running long enough. If I can buy these people one more sunrise, I'll stand and fight. Nalene stepped forward, her knife gleaming in the first light of dawn. Then I stand with you. My honor will not be cut again. For a moment, Jonas saw her not as the shamed bride, but as something more, an ember that refused to die, even under ash. He knew then that whatever happened, this fight would bind their fates forever. The sound of the approaching column grew louder, a drumbeat of war rolling through the desert. The Apache gathered, silent but ready. The children were led into the mountain passes, the elders blessing them with whispered prayers. Jonas checked his revolver, tightened the cinch on his horse. The lieutenant was coming, and this time one of them would not leave the desert alive. The sun rose blood-red over the Dragoon Mountains, spilling fire across the desert floor. Dust clouds churned on the horizon as the army column thundered closer, rows of soldiers in blue, rifles gleaming, wagons rolling heavy with supplies and vengeance. The Apache camp stood ready. Women and children had already vanished into the mountain passes, led by elders and guarded by scouts. What remained were warriors, silent as stone, their faces painted with ash and resolve. At the center stood Naline, her short hair whipped in the desert wind, and in her hands she held not only her bow, but the knife she had sharpened through the night. This was no longer the bride who had cried by the fire. This was the spirit of her people, born anew in defiance. Jonas Hale tightened his horse's reins, his revolver heavy at his side, rifle across his saddle. His jaw was set, his eyes hard. He had run from battles before, turned away when cruelty burned too bright, but not today. Today he would not run. Chief Dazen raised his arm. "We do not fight for death," he said, his voice carrying across the warriors. "We fight for life, for every child who still breathes, for every song yet to be sung." The warriors answered with a cry that split the sky, raw and fierce. Then the soldiers came. The lieutenant rode at the front, his saber raised high, his eyes burning with fury. He remembered the canyon, he remembered the girl, he remembered his humiliation. This morning he came for blood. The first clash was thunder. Rifle fire cracked, arrows whistled, smoke rolled in thick curtains, horses screamed, men shouted, and the desert became a storm of iron and fire. Jonas fired from horseback. His shots measured, each one dropping a soldier, before he spurred his horse into the melee. He saw the lieutenant's saber flash through the smoke, and felt rage boil like molten lead in his veins. Naline fought like a spirit unleashed. She loosed arrows from the ridge until her quiver was empty, then leaped into the fray with her knife. Soldiers sneered when they saw her, the girl with the shorn hair, but their sneers ended in screams. She moved, swift, precise, every strike fueled by memory of her shame. The lieutenant's voice rose above the chaos. "Bring me the girl," he roared, his saber cutting men down. Jonas spurred forward, charging straight at him. The two met in a clash of steel and fury. Jonas's revolver against the officer's saber. The first swing missed his throat by inches. Jonas fired point blank, but the lieutenant's horse reared, throwing the shot wide. They circled, teeth bared, two men who knew only one would leave the desert alive. Naline saw it, her heart hammering. She scrambled through the melee, soldiers clawing at her. Rifles raised, but she cut through them like the desert wind, driven by something greater than fear. Jonas caught a slash across his shoulder, blood spraying hot, but he stayed in the saddle. He slammed his revolver into the lieutenant's jaw, knocking him sideways. The officer snarled, rage twisting his face, and raised his saber for a killing blow. But before it fell, an arrow struck his chest, then another. His eyes widened, confusion giving way to shock. He staggered in the saddle, blood dark against his blue coat. Naline stood behind him, bow still trembling in her hands, her face lit with fire. The lieutenant dropped his saber, gasping, and toppled from his horse into the dust. His final breath rattled into silence. The battle broke soon after. The soldiers, leaderless and bloodied, fled into the desert, leaving their dead behind. The Apache stood tall among the smoke and wreckage, weary but unbroken. As the sun climbed higher, Naline stood over the fallen lieutenant. She bent, cutting a strip of his coat, and tied it into her short hair. "My honor is mine again," she whispered. Jonas watched her, bleeding but alive. For the first time in years, he felt something he thought he'd lost purpose. The fire of shame had been turned into the fire of strength, and in the ashes of battle, an Apache bride's spirit had risen unbowed.